Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 2315, or World History 1. The subject for this week is one we've kind of been building towards as we looked at the development of civilizations along the largest river valleys in the Old World. And this week we're focusing on the Nile River Valley and the emergence of the Egyptian Empire. And so really what we're looking at here is we're looking at its earliest dynastic sort of developments. And there are a number of phases that ancient Egypt is going to pass through. And then by the end, and very much mirroring what they've been talking about in your textbook, is we're going to see that Egypt is being disrupted a number of times by outsiders who come in and rule. And the last time this is going to happen is when the Greeks come through. When Alexander the Great comes in, he's going to install something known as the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And that's really going to be the dynasty that lasts up until the time they are conquered by the Roman Empire. In particular, the city of Alexandria being kind of the crown jewel of Egypt at that time. So we have a lot of history to go through, and as usual in this video, I'm going to try to hit the high points to keep it as brief as I can, but we do have a pretty comprehensive case study in looking at Egypt this week, from the earliest pharaonic dynasties all the way up to the Ptolemies. Diving right in, any discussion of Egypt, in particular ancient Egypt, really revolves around the physical geography of this land. This area is really unique, and obviously, as we've been discussing, these great rivers and these great river valleys are the sites of human civilizations emerging. The Nile River here in Egypt is no different. This is hands down the most important physical feature in Egypt. And actually, it kind of extends beyond Egypt, as you well know. It flows all the way down through Ethiopia and all the way down into the eastern highlands of East Africa. So the river is 4,000 miles long, and in the area that Egypt is, it's flowing right through the middle of the Saharan desert. Without the waters of the Nile, human beings can't live in this region. It's really more of a stark contrast than we see in Mesopotamia or China or India. Obviously, those civilizations needed the water, they needed the rivers there as well. But the Nile's a little bit different, because once you move outside of the immediate vicinity of the Nile, it is completely unlivable. It is a dead wasteland of desert. And so, the human beings that are living in the Nile River Basin are really relying upon the floodwaters of the Nile. The Nile floods every spring. When they get the spring rains, the river floods, overflows, and it produces silt. This is deposits of rich black soil that make the ground and the area really suitable for agriculture. So really what the inhabitants of ancient Egypt are relying upon is that this river is going to flood every single spring and make the area right around the river inhabitable and capable of agricultural production. And so it's just this narrow band of land that right around the river that's going to produce one of the ancient world's largest and most sustainable empires. So when we're looking at the Nile, it's important to be familiar with a couple of different features of this river. First, we have the Nile Delta. And this is a really, really critical area of development in ancient Egypt, and then even in the years past ancient Egypt, all the way up to the present. The Nile Delta is still a very key feature of Egyptian society. But this is the geographic region in the north of modern-day Egypt. Essentially, this is the mouth, or the delta. This is the mouth where the river discharges into the Mediterranean Sea. This is Egypt's most fertile area. It's where all of the richest silt deposits are found. And these silt deposits are naturally building up in greater quantities around the mouth of the river than they are further upstream. So the Egyptians, when they're looking at the land that they live in, they make this key distinction. And the deposits of the silt around the Nile Delta is what helps them make this distinction. They call this area where agriculture is possible, mostly in the Delta, but then even if you're going a little bit further south geographically, the entire band around the Nile River, they call this black land. And it's called black land because of these silt deposits. It's producing this very rich, very deep black soil that is well known to be good for agriculture. In fact, there's a similar corollary here in the United States. There's an area from Georgia and South Carolina that kind of stretches all the way over to East Texas, what a lot of people would refer to as the Deep South. This is what they call the Black Belt in the United States, and that is where you have the most successful agricultural output. So that also happens to be where American slavery persisted for the longest because of the agricultural scheme there. But it's the same basic idea. Rich black soil means good growing conditions, pretty much universally. And the same is true here in Egypt. And they compare black land to what they call red land. This is the desert. And when the Egyptians look at the desert, it's not just, well, that's the area where we can't live. This has a lot more importance to Egyptians. They call that area red land, and it literally is a wasteland in the Egyptian mind. And even in their religion, there's a lot of duality in the worldview and the cosmology of ancient Egyptians. They don't necessarily see death as this finite end to life. They see death and life in a constant interplay. They believe in these ideas of reincarnation, rebirth, that things move in cycles, that there's, and they see their land in the same way. The red land is the sort of polar opposite of the black land, and they work in this duality. Without one, you couldn't have the other. It's hard to define one without the other. But it's an important distinction that ancient Egyptians made in their minds, and it describes how they see the world around them. The black land is human land, and the red land beyond it is seen as this sort of scary, dangerous, frontier wasteland that nobody really ever needs to go into. The red land is basically like a forbidden forest in African history. It's something you come across quite a bit in West African history. They have the same thing in Native American cultures in the Americas, where they have this area that's basically uninhabitable, and thus it becomes this place where ghouls and demons and monsters and dangerous animals live, dangerous weather conditions. They sort of ascribe everything that is negative in the human experience, and they say that's what exists out there in the red land. We stay here in the black land because the red land is no good. And so that's sort of the dichotomy they build for themselves in viewing the world. Another key feature of the Nile that you need to be familiar with are the cataracts. Now, cataracts are shallow areas of rivers where you generally have whitewater rapids occurring. When the flow over the rocks gets to be more shallow, it produces more turbulence on the surface of the river. And so, if you're following the Nile south, it has to flow through a number of cataracts. And so these the currents, the cataracts, and then also in some areas waterfalls made sailing the entire length of the Nile impossible. You couldn't start at the Mediterranean and sail all the way down to the East African highlands in one unabated shot. Really, there are 6 cataracts. There's a lot of argument over how many there actually are. There's 6 recognized cataracts along the Nile River, and then there's also numerous waterfalls that dot the area. But this is important because what it means is you can't go into Egypt on a boat and then tour the entire country. And this also has an important element for defense and defending the land. Now, Egypt is going to fall to outside invaders a number of times in its history. But what won't happen is these invaders never use the length of the Nile to traverse and basically carry out war on the country. Once you hit the first cataract going south, you can no longer travel by boat. You have to portage. You have to pull all your boats off the river, move past the Whitewater Rapid, then put your boats back in the river and start sailing again. This is really cumbersome if you're trying to carry out a naval expedition, and it's not really possible. So what this means is that every invasion we're going to see in Egyptian history, it's not going to come by way of the river. It's going to come by way of land. And so, in a lot of ways, the Nile, through its cataracts and waterfalls, helped to protect a lot of ancient Egyptians from invasion. In fact, what we tend to see is that the areas that get invaded most easily and readily are the ones above the first cataract. So if you're coming in from the Mediterranean, and these are the areas that ultimately are going to lead to the collapse of the Egyptian Empire, those areas are going to be invaded from the Mediterranean, and it's usually a land war that hits right up until the first cataract. So it's really one of these things where things like that and the Blue Nile Falls that I talked not much about in the lecture, but it's those kinds of impediments to travel that stop people from using the Nile to just come in and conquer Egypt from one end to the other. So when we look at Egypt's geography, it gets a little confusing, and I'll admit that this is where it becomes hard for a Western person who's just sitting there looking at a map of northeastern Africa to understand how they came up with their geographic designations. But Egypt in its earliest phase, after you had nomads moving into the area to live in this fertile area around the Nile, the first centralized societies that you're going to see there emerge geographically. They split into two separate areas. You have the northern kingdom, which in their day they called Lower Egypt. This is the area that's right along the Mediterranean in its true geographic north. This is the area around the mouth of the Nile Delta. Up here, there's a milder climate, and they're really more connected to the Mediterranean world than they are to any location south in Africa. And in this region, they worship, the chief deity in this area is a female goddess known as Wadjet. Wadjet is the cobra goddess, represented by a snake. The Egyptian cobra being one of the more feared and deadly snakes in this region. This is showing the sort of animistic religion or religious structure that the ancient Egyptians followed. They saw the Egyptian cobra as being a representation of a deity, of strength and of power. And then you have the other kingdom, which is called the Upper Kingdom in ancient Egypt, which is actually south. It's the Southern Kingdom. And so this is, if you're following the map down, this is the area that you're going to find bordering African kingdoms. This is the area that's bordering Nubia in the Kingdom of Kush. This is the area that's coming into contact with sub-Saharan Africans more readily. And they're also living in a much warmer climate, one that's a little bit harder to produce agriculture in. And down in this land, they worship Nekbet. Nekbet is the vulture goddess. And so it's kind of interesting to see that these two civilizations, as they're emerging in these two separate regions of what will become ancient Egypt, we're really seeing that they're both worshiping female deities. And that's something that sort of reflects fertility and the importance of fertility in the Egyptian mindset. Fertility is an idea that extends beyond human fertility, and it goes into natural fertility. Fertility is important to an agricultural society. If your lands aren't fertile, if that Nile River doesn't flood every spring and deposit that silt, you don't grow enough food to feed your society, and widespread starvation is going to happen, and after that you have economic collapse. And so it is telling that we see both the northern and the southern kingdoms worshiping goddesses rather than gods, because fertility is such an important concept in the ancient Egyptian mind. And that's where we get these deities of Wadjet, the cobra goddess, and Nekbet, the vulture goddess, being the chief gods of Upper and Lower Egypt. So, now, one of the more important things that's going to happen is the unification of these two kingdoms. This is where we really start talking about ancient Egypt proper. When these two kingdoms come together, they will form the early dynastic period. They're unifying somewhere around roughly 3200 BCE. And the early dynastic period is usually dated between 3200 and 2780 BCE. That's the time period before we have the emergence of a different sort of culture that's going to come out of ancient Egypt, one that we're all far more familiar with. And we'll get there in due time. I don't want to spoil the surprise. So, the ruler of Upper Egypt at this time, which, remember, when we're saying Upper Egypt is actually south, down the area bordering the African kingdoms in the south of the Nile. There's a king there who, historically, he's been named Menes. Menes is usually the name that's given to this individual who invades Lower Egypt, or the northern region, the northern territories of Egypt. He invades and conquers these areas, and he brings them together. But more recently, historians have found out that really the guy's name was probably Narmer. And Narmer is actually, they were thought to be Menes and Narmer were thought to be two different rulers in this area. And credit has always been given to this guy Menes as invading and conquering the northern territories that they called Lower Egypt and unifying these two kingdoms. But more recent scholarship argues pretty convincingly that these are two different names for the same guy. That really the more proper name is Narmer. He's the one who brings these two kingdoms together and unifies Upper and Lower Egypt. And when he does this, he establishes a new capital city at Memphis. And so during the early dynastic period, Memphis is going to be the epicenter of life, political, religious, and cultural in Egyptian society. Now, when he brings these two kingdoms together, when he unifies Upper and Lower Egypt, he is going to very, very astutely and sort of strategically adopt both kingdoms' symbols. He takes the snake and the vulture. And both of the kingdoms had two different crowns. One had a red crown and one had a white crown. He is going to unify these crowns together to show that I'm not just in control of one kingdom, I am in control of both the unified upper and lower Egyptian kingdoms. The upper Egyptian kingdom was a white crown, and that white crown would ultimately have the deity of Nekbet on it, because that was their chief deity. And the red crown of Lower Egypt is going to have the representation of the cobra on it. And so they're going to bring these two crowns together, and they make a double crown. That's known as the Phesent, or sometimes just the Shent, is the actual pronunciation of the word. So Narmer, when he does this, when he brings these crowns together and he wears this newly minted headdress that carries this symbol of authority, I don't just conquer one, I'm not in charge of one region. I am in control of all of this area of Egypt. He is going to become Egypt's very first pharaoh. This is a name or a title that you're probably well familiar with. And so this is the beginning of a kingdom that is going to be established and sustain itself throughout 31 successive dynasties. There are going to be intermediate periods in between, but the dynastic history of Egypt starts with the first pharaoh, Narmer. And of course, a pharaoh is another name for a monarch or a ruler in ancient Egypt. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that title means when we work through the social structure of ancient Egypt. So when we look at this is the early dynastic period, and Narmer is going to establish himself as the first pharaoh. And really what we see during this period, that's what's important. If you're looking at an exam and I ask you what is the key feature of the early dynastic period, it is the unification of these two kingdoms and the bringing together of these two deities to create the origins of an ancient Egyptian pantheon. Something that will come up again and again as you're reading about when we talk through ancient Egypt. We're going to be looking at shifts in the deities and in the pantheon and what that means to leadership and authority within the kingdom. But after the early dynastic period, we get to a period of Egyptian history known as the Old Kingdom. They generally break, historians and Egyptologists who really are more expert in this field, they break Egyptian history up into three basic phases: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And each one of these periods is bordered by an intermediate period where the dynasties break down or become weak or inefficient in their rule. But the Old Kingdom is generally believed to have started somewhere around 2686 BCE. And this is when the third Egyptian dynastic ruler by the name of Djoser becomes pharaoh, the new pharaoh. And so when we look at the Old Kingdom in terms of society and politics, there's very little that distinguishes this era from the early dynastic period. The first pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, Djoser, this guy we were just talking about, he was a hereditary ruler. Basically what that means is he carried on, he has a blood claim to the throne. He's blood, he's family to the last rulers of Egypt in the early dynastic period. So it's not like we're seeing a change in leadership where it's passing from one family to another. It stays within the family. The borders and boundaries of Egypt don't change significantly from the early dynastic period to the Old Kingdom. What does change and what makes it sort of really different are two key features that we in the modern day tend to associate with Egypt. And that is the growth and building of pyramids as sort of politically and religiously important centers of Egyptian society, and the construction, or I guess the sort of practice of making man-made mummies. So when we think of Egypt, you think generally pyramids and mummies. These are features that are associated with the Old Kingdom. That's when those habits really start. It is during the Old Kingdom period that the Egyptians begin the practice of mummifying their dead, or at least the illustrious or wealthy dead, and constructing massive pyramids to house, basically work as burial chambers for their emperors, kings, or what they call pharaohs. So, taking a look at this guy Djoser a little more closely, he is the first pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, and he reigns from 2686 to 2648 BCE. So he is most generally by historians, he's considered the likely founder of the third dynasty. And it's believed that he is the first Egyptian ruler to kind of strike out of the borders of modern-day Egypt. And he carries out some military expeditions in the Sinai Peninsula, which he's going to conquer and control for a short period of time. The reason he does this ties into some of the other history that we've been looking at. He's trying to put this buffer zone in between himself and the very powerful civilizations that are growing up in Mesopotamia. But really, when we look at Djoser and what he's best remembered for, is he is the one who builds the first major pyramid that we are aware of and have unearthed. He's going to build his pyramid at a place called Saqqara. Now, this is going to be the start of the tradition of pyramid building that defines all of the rulers of the Old Kingdom. Djoser's pyramid is not as famous as the three that you're probably thinking of at Giza. Djoser's pyramid is not the smooth-sided pyramid that we think of in Egypt. It's actually a step pyramid, more similar to what you see in areas like Latin America, like when you look at Peru and some of these areas of the old empires there. They're more known for building these step pyramids that kind of go up like that and create rectangles every way down, like that. So he is going to begin with the step pyramid, but all of his successors start changing the type of architectural construction. They're going to be the ones, the kings who come after him start building the smooth-sided pyramids, which, if you think about it, is actually a very, very difficult task. To build a step pyramid is sort of self-explanatory. You're just basically building foundational layers on top of each other and stacking them. To build a smooth-sided pyramid is a much more intricate and difficult technological feat, if you will. So, as a fun side note, Halloween is, always on my mind, and I like to think about mummies and all this stuff, vampires and how they tie into history. It's during Djoser's reign. The guy who actually builds his step pyramid is a vizier, or an important scholar known as Imhotep. Now, if you're familiar with Imhotep, it's probably more by way of the famous Hollywood story of the mummy. Imhotep has been recast in literature and then later on in cinema as being the guy who gets mummified and buried with these curses put on him so that he one day rises from the dead and terrorizes whatever period he happens to wake up in. But that's the Imhotep of myth and of folklore. But the real-life Imhotep was probably the second most important person in Egypt when Djoser was the pharaoh. He's the one who is really credited with building the first pyramid in Egyptian history. But of course, he's now more famous for being in movies with Brendan Fraser and Tom Cruise and the like. So, pyramids are a big part of the Old Kingdom. Mummies are another key feature. And really, like I said, those are the two things most people think of when they think of Egypt. And they are both facets of and developments of the Old Kingdom. So the process of making mummies is generally withheld in Egypt for the politically important, the wealthy elite, and the priestly class within the Old Kingdom. This is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what mummification is, it's the practice of deliberately drying and preserving a body of a dead person or animal for the afterlife. When I was in school, mummies were people, right? You always saw the guy, he's wrapped up like this, and probably breathing dust out, his breath smells nasty, all that good stuff. It's actually, we're starting to find out that far more people, far more scholars are uncovering the mummies of animals. Animals were oftentimes mummified, and really actively mummified in ancient Egypt. And it was a set of specific animals that are associated with certain deities in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. But what's interesting about mummification is the process probably starts accidentally. That's how it starts most places around the world. Mummification's not specific to Egypt. They have an incredibly intricate and well understood way of mummifying, a very effective method of mummification, more so than some of the other practices we see in other parts of the world. But what generally happens is you have this dry, really, really desolate desert surrounding Egypt. And what people probably saw was that when people or animals died in the desert, that tended to slow decomposition and naturally preserve the corpses. You see the same thing kind of happening in areas of northern Europe where somebody falls into a peat bog and then they pull him out 50 years later and he looks like he hasn't aged a day. He's not decomposing or anything because there's no oxygen down there to start the decomposition process. So it starts by just basically witnessing what happens in different environments in the natural world. But it was used by Egyptians to preserve a body for the afterlife. And this is important because Egyptian religion basically said that if a body it was not whole, if it didn't have all of its parts, it wouldn't be able to prosper in the afterlife. Basically, you're going to be whatever you're buried as, that's what you are in the afterlife. So if I bury you without a leg, you're going to be hopping around on one leg in the afterlife. And so humans are basically being mummified so that they can pass over into the afterlife and have everything they need, body parts. And as time goes on, this is going to become a little bit more of an intricate process. But humans, as I mentioned, are not the only mummies in ancient Egypt. We see tons and tons and tons of mummified crocodiles, cats, birds, usually like ibexes. Sorry, no, that's ibises. Ibex is like some sort of ungulate creature. But no, ibises. You have a lot of, because they're very important. These animals are representatives of deities. Namely, crocodile god is Sobek, the cat god is Bastet or Bath, and then you also have the bird god is Ibis. So these animals are basically seen as human embodiments or living embodiments of the deities like Sobek, Bastet. They're seen as representatives. They're not the god itself. They don't look at an average cat on the street and go, well, there's the god Bast or Bastet. They go, oh, okay, that cat represents that deity. That's a practice we call animism. It's where you see real animate objects around the world as being representatives of the spirit world. Now, what starts as an important religious function, all about being able to get the body to pass in the right way into the afterlife, really quickly devolves into a status symbol. The wealthy are going to start to pay top dollar to make sure they're properly mummified, and they're being buried with riches beyond belief. Because they also believe it's not just, I don't just need my body going to the afterlife. I need money. I need slaves. I need attendants. I need perfumes. I need liquor. I need all the things I need in real life. Food. It's all got to be buried with me. Because if it's not, I won't have it in the afterlife. And so the pharaohs of Egypt are naturally going to have the most ornate mummification process. So after their bodies are preserved, wrapped in the papyrus linens, they would be placed in large, elaborate coffins known as sarcophagi, the singular of that word being sarcophagus. So mummification is described in a lot of different texts that we've received from ancient Egypt. The one that we see it mentioned in most readily is the Egyptians' rituals of the dead. Now, these rituals of the dead, they don't actually talk too much about the mummification process. They don't talk about the medical procedure to mummify someone. But they talk about all of the rituals that need to be done alongside the process of mummification. Because this is all about propitiation, getting somebody prepared in the right way to enter the afterlife. So it's not just about what you're doing to their body, it's about how you're also preparing their soul for the afterlife. And there's a lot of different methods and levels of mummification. They have proper mummification and like sort of, you can look at it like this. You got the Cadillac of mummification and then the Pontiac of mummification. And a lot of different levels in between. And how you're mummified represents who you were in life, how wealthy you were. Some people are getting a very poor mummification job where they're basically just being dried out, wrapped, and thrown into the ground. Other people are being really, really elaborately prepared, a process that takes months. Most of the Egyptian mummies are going to be preserved with a chemical known as natron, or natron. So, this is something that's readily found around Egypt. It's being dug out and mined for. And it's a very common desiccant. Basically, that means it dries stuff out. And so human beings are being hit with this. Natron is formed into like a white powder. And it actually sucks all the water right out of the body. Now, that works for the skin and it works for the exterior, the facade of the body. But now that doesn't do much in terms of the way of their organs. So most of the time, especially for the higher end, the Cadillac version of mummification, they would have all of their organs removed, including their brain. I'm sure most of you have probably heard they got this really specialized hook where they go up through the nostril and they pull someone's brain right out through their nose hole. Doesn't seem pleasant. But luckily you're already dead. Now, they're going to remove the brain, they're going to take out the heart, they're going to take out all of your internal organs, and they're going to preserve them in ritualistic jars. The body is then being stuffed with potpourri, other expensive perfumes and products. Sometimes they're stuffing gold and precious jewels inside the body. And so this is going to be something, again, it's all about preparing them for the afterlife. Just like we get up in the morning, we take a shower, we put on deodorant, we brush our teeth, we put on cologne or perfume, we don't want to walk around stinking. Well, you don't want to stink in the afterlife either. And so they stuff them with potpourri and they prepare their body in this way. And then the mummies would generally at the end be wrapped in papyrus cloth, usually with some sort of ritualized or religious inscription on them. And so there's literally there's writings, and in a lot of ways, there's curses. This is where we get the idea of the curse of the mummy. A lot of fiction has its origins in fact. There are inscriptions and ritualistic writings on the cloth that they're being wrapped in. And so essentially this is basically an invocation or a sort of a curse saying if you unwrap this mummy, if you mess with their body, if you steal from them, if you mess with their coffins or sarcophagi, then you're going to basically be cursed and this bad fortune and bad luck are going to follow you. And so that's where we get this idea of the curse of the mummy, is that on these most of the inscriptions are not curses. Most of them are just basically propitiation to the deities. Please accept this body into the world of the dead, those kinds of things. But that is generally what we're seeing in the terms of the process of mummification. And again, what's important to understand about it is this starts as a religious thing and it quickly becomes a social marker. It's not just about, I need to be mummified for my spiritual well-being. Mummification is also about, hey, look how wealthy I am. I can afford to have the nicest kind of mummification. They use the best natron on me. They took out my organs in the most delicate of ways, and they put them in the nicest jars, and they stuck the best potpourri in my body. And that's how everyone knows I'm a rich, super important guy. Not just in this life, but in the next. What you do in this world carries over into the afterlife in the ancient Egyptian cosmology. So, this idea of status symbol ties pretty nicely to our discussion of the pyramids. The pyramids are basically burial chambers. And as you can imagine, something that big and that elaborate as a burial chamber, I mean, heck, I even think the mausoleums down south that I see around here in Louisiana, those are pretty elaborate for a guy from up north. They usually throw our bodies in the ground with a stone marker, and that's about it. But the death is not the end of the journey for Egyptians. And so it's just the beginning. It's a recycling. It's a renewal phase. You move into the next life, and there's an afterlife, and you're reborn into that life. And so how you go out in this world is kind of important, and the pyramids are representative of that. The largest pyramids, and the ones that you're probably familiar with when you look at pictures, are the pyramids located near the city of Giza. The area around these three great pyramids that build up there is known as the necropolis, or the city of the dead. And so basically the whole area it's basically a giant graveyard. And the most important people living in Egyptian society would be buried in this necropolis, because essentially, again, your world in life is going to be reflected. There's a mirror image of it in the afterlife. So they built a city for the dead, the important people who would all be living together in this necropolis in the afterlife. So Giza essentially becomes the place where all of the tombs are put for pharaohs. And after we have Djoser come through, most of the pharaohs are going to be basically building pyramids for themselves to be buried in. The wealthy, the important, the politically connected will be buried in tombs that are in the necropolis but don't have this monster pyramid coming up from the top. So inside the pyramids, there's usually a hollow chamber that's used for the actual burial, where you're going to move somebody down and get them through there. As royalty is being buried in pyramids, ancient Egyptians they believe that you can bring anything you want with you. So they're going to be buried down there with money, resources, goods, products, food. A lot of the pharaohs are being buried with slaves. Their slaves are being ritually killed and buried with them so that these slaves could actually go and serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. So you're also seeing, in addition to all that, gold, precious diamonds, precious jewels, all these different kinds of very, very exotic and hard to get and expensive products in ancient Egypt. They're being buried in the tombs alongside the pharaohs. So obviously, if you're hard up for money, this becomes a pretty attractive target. And so grave robbing is a major concern in ancient Egypt. To deal with grave robbers, they actually the architects who design these things, they start really putting these deadly sort of booby traps inside to keep the grave robbers out. And so this builds into that whole myth of the curse of the mummy, the curse of the pharaohs, that you can't go in and mess or do anything in these in these burial chambers, in these pyramids, because this curse is designed to protect them. The afterlife and the spiritual world is protecting them. In reality, there's very practical man-made traps built inside of a lot of these pyramids, and they're solely designed to keep out grave robbers. As I mentioned, pyramid design is going to change really shortly. Pretty much the immediate rulers, pharaohs following Djoser, they're going to start to shift away from the step pyramid design towards the smooth-sided pyramid that we're mostly familiar with. And so it's his successors. There's three pharaohs. Their names are Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And these are, or not Mena, I'm not fluent in ancient Egyptian, so forgive me, Menkaure. These are the pharaohs that built the Great Pyramids at Giza. Whenever you see the images of Egypt and you see those big three pyramids right next to each other with a small little one right in front, those are the Great Pyramids at Giza, and they were built by Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure separately. And so those are really, when you look and you think about this, we're talking BCE. How do you go about this massive construction project? And so obviously you think to yourself, this is going to take great planning and it's going to take great skill. Really, it's all about time, right? That's what we're talking about here. And so what they would usually do is the day that I become pharaoh, let's say they're going to make Pharaoh Davy the next pharaoh. The day that I am initiated as the new pharaoh, I immediately set about ordering the construction of my pyramid because it's going to take that long for them to finish it. I'm basically saying if I don't order it now, it won't be ready by the time I'm dead. So that's what they're going to do is as soon as you're made pharaoh, you start ordering you give the order to start building your pyramid so that you'll have a place to go when you die. The pyramids generally are being built from the inside out. And that's how they're going to carry out this construction. They plan the interior first, and then the exterior is just simply a facade on top of almost a completely separate structure. So basically what you're seeing above the ground, very little of that has much inside of it. That's actually just solid construction. Most of what you enter into and walk around in is beneath the actual pyramid you see. It's a common misperception. Most people, if you go walk downtown in Houston and say, who built the pyramids? They're going to say it was the Jewish slaves that are talked about in the Old Testament of the Bible. And so that is not accurate. Slaves did not build the pyramids. It is a common misperception that they did, and most people are going to tell you it was the Jewish slaves that built the pyramid. That is not how it worked. This is how it worked. The vast majority of Egyptian society is agricultural, and you have a finite growing season. You don't work in agriculture year-round. And so peasants, the farmers and the peasants, were actually required to work. Freeborn people are being required to work 1 month out of the year to work on building these pyramids. And they would generally do this when their growing season was over and they had a little bit of downtime. In addition to those free laborers that are just contributing to it in their downtime, you have professional craftsmen, you have architects, artists, planners that are designing these pyramids. This is an architectural masterpiece. This is not easy to build, especially without modern equipment like cranes and stuff like that. And so they're the ones who sort of oversee the construction of these pyramids from start to finish. Now, I'd say that the pyramids were not built by slaves. That's not to say the Egyptians didn't have slaves. They certainly did. It is a absolute fact that Jewish slavery did occur. It's attested to in both Egyptian sources and Hebrew sources. But they also had a far greater number of slaves from Africa. The Egyptians would most readily take slaves from the immediate areas south, areas like the Kingdom of Cush and Nubia. Pretty much sub-Saharan Africans formed a large part of the slave class in ancient Egypt. But there were also other types of slaves. Slavery wasn't race-based in Egypt. They had Aegean slaves, people of Greek origin. They had Near Eastern slaves taken from Mesopotamia, the Sinai Peninsula, the Levant, those areas. And so the slaves are being forced to work on other construction projects. In a lot of ways, they don't really build the pyramids because to build the pyramids or to contribute to them is seen as an honor. And that's an honor that they're not really going to afford to a lot of slaves in Egyptian society. And so slaves are really working on other construction projects. They're building roadways. They're being used as military figures. And they're used as domestic servants in Egyptian society. Really, when you look at it, the people who had it the worst when you talk about slavery in ancient Egypt are the temple slaves. Slaves that would serve inside of a temple had the lowest and worst quality of life. They were most often subjected to beatings, ritualistic sacrifice. It's just a bad position to be in. But the majority of people who are living in slavery in Egypt, they might not meet our modern definition of slavery. They're being forced to work for no money, so it's textbook definition, yes, they're slaves. But they're actually treated more like serfs in Egyptian society. So that is a nice sort of segue into the political and social structures of ancient Egypt. I've talked about the hierarchy of ancient Egypt in my PowerPoint lecture. And it all starts at the top with the pharaoh, and it steps down to his vizier and his senior officials and the high priests and the nobles. Then you drop down to the next level of their hierarchy, and it's scribes and scholars, educated people. Beneath them are skilled artisans and craftspeople, and beneath them are the peasants and farmers and the workers, and at the very bottom you have indentured servants and slaves in Egyptian society. So when we look at the political class, it's really made up of the pharaohs, the scribes, the vizier, and these sort of senior officials and high priests, the priestly class. So the pharaohs are the head of government, and they're a monarch, and usually they're a male king. There's a few exceptions here. The most notable one is Cleopatra. But most people tend not to think of Cleopatra as a true Egyptian ruler. She's actually a foreign ruler from Greece. But there's arguments there. There's only one, we'll talk about her, but Hatshepsut. She's the only female pharaoh in Egyptian history. But they're usually male kings. And they're given the title of pharaoh. And what that translates to is, it translates to great house. In other words, the pharaoh is the house in which Egyptians live. Every Egyptian works for the well-being of the pharaoh. There's no such thing as, we have concepts like national pride, and we can separate America from the president. We can separate America from the political class. We are capable of saying, I work for the well-being of the United States. As a soldier would say, I defend the United States of America, not necessarily one person who runs it. This is not how it works in Egypt. The pharaoh is Egypt. He is the Egyptian empire. He is the Egyptian kingdom. He is everything. He's the dynasty. So the people of Egypt work for the pharaoh. He is the great house. And this is because they have divine authority. They are seen basically as living gods and goddesses. And because of this, Egypt is ruled as a theocracy. It's a state ruled by religious figures. The pharaoh is a religious figure because they're believed to be a living god. And then underneath them, the priest class is going to basically be a big part of their political class as well. So really, ancient Egypt is a theocracy. Their authority and their political power all comes from religious authority. Now, underneath the pharaoh are the bureaucrats, because the pharaoh can't rule this massive territory by himself. They're aided by this bureaucracy, and many of the people who make up the upper classes of the political classes of ancient Egypt, the people who form this bureaucracy, are usually relatives of the pharaoh. That's why dynasties are so important in Egyptian history. It's not just the guy you put in charge. He picks all the people around him who form the upper echelon or the political class of ancient Egypt. The most powerful official under the pharaoh is the vizier, a position I already mentioned, one that Imhotep held during Djoser's reign. A vizier is essentially a prime minister to a king or a top official in the government. In a lot of ways, there were a lot of times in Egyptian history where the vizier is considered to be more powerful than the pharaoh themselves. A good corollary of this that I can think of is sort of like modern day England. In England, you have the Queen. And in a lot of ways, the Queen has no real political authority. She's a figurehead. The Prime Minister is the one who runs the day-to-day affairs of the country. And so in a lot of ways, this is how it works in Egypt too. When you have a weak pharaoh who's not particularly autocratic, the vizier will generally become the most important political figure in the land, and the pharaoh is simply a figurehead. And then underneath the vizier, you have hundreds of lesser officials that would keep Egypt running smoothly on a day-to-day basis. They work in little outposts in different areas. So basically you'd have a governor, you'd have somebody, a mayor, somebody in more localized positions making sure everything is being carried out properly in ancient Egypt. And then when you see Egypt expanding outwards, for example, when they conquer Nubia for a short time, they install a military governor there known as a viceroy. This is pretty common in the structure of Egyptian leadership. When they newly conquer a territory, they put a military governor in first to pacify the area before they bring in civil government. So that is basically the political class of the Egyptians. And that all these things become established during the Old Kingdom, but they're going to be maintained throughout the Middle and New Kingdom too. And so the Old Kingdom collapses somewhere around 2100 BCE. And really it's warfare and economic strife that lasts for 200 years. They start having problems with outside invaders threatening the ruling class of Egypt after the Old Kingdom. And so for 200 years, there's basically a power vacuum. Nobody can find a legitimate ruler of Egypt. They're kind of a leaderless state. You have regencies and interim governments coming up, but they don't last very long. There's no stability. Excuse me. So, a new dynasty finally emerges and begins in 2055 BCE. So, this is known as the Middle Kingdom. This is the beginning or the origins of the Middle Kingdom. The strong leadership brought stability. And this is going to end the sort of chaotic period known as the First Intermediate Period, this time period of lawlessness and a lack of governance. So, during the Middle Kingdom, Egypt established really, really strong trade relationships with surrounding lands, and this led to greater wealth for the Egyptian government. Now, this is important because there's two, in the same way I said, the Old Kingdom, you want to associate that with mummies and pyramids. The Middle Kingdom should be associated with the expansion of trade and the growth of an actual middle class in Egyptian society. No longer do you have just haves and have-nots. There's actually people in between that are doing okay for themselves. They live a comfortable lifestyle, but they're not exceptionally wealthy or politically connected. And it's the establishment of these trade routes that allows for a middle class to grow during the Middle Kingdom. So, it's kind of easy to remember, right? Middle Kingdom, middle class. There's a mnemonic device for you all. So, these trade routes are not always safe. They are constantly beset with bandits, murderers, marauders, robbers, whatever you want to call them. They're people trying to take advantage of the lack of safety on these roadways, these trade routes. So, ultimately, what they're going to end up doing to try to bring this problem under control is you start to see the construction of large fortresses being built all along the Nile River and along the trade routes that run into and out of the region. So, the Middle Kingdom, I'm kind of keeping it brief here because the Old Kingdom is so much more fun, right? Mummies and pyramids. So I'm going to gloss over Middle and New Kingdom. I'm not going to lie to you. But the Middle Kingdom comes to an end. It actually is destroyed when the Hyksos, or rulers from another land, something you read about in your textbook, I think about 2 weeks back now, they invaded Egypt from the east, and they conquered the territory, bringing an end to the Middle Kingdom. Usually around the date we give there is 1650 BCE. Now, the Hyksos are a group that are they come from the Levant. So they're of Levantine origin. And again, as far as the Egyptians are concerned, these are lawless barbarians and marauders who invaded the land. They're desert dwellers. And so, again, we saw that dichotomy of the city, the state, the empire emerges, this big centralized power, but it still has these outlying frontier lands where people aren't a part of this major unit. And so, again, going back to these trends we've been reading about in the textbook, these Hyksos, rulers from another land, as they're called, accomplished the collapse of the Middle Kingdom basically by bringing in horse-drawn chariots. They use this as a weapon of war that they're experts on, and they use this against Egypt. And so the Hyksos are going to be rulers for, I think, about 100 years in Egyptian society. They're in there for a century, and they make some technological improvements and advances. They actually modernize Egypt's military. They introduced the horse-drawn chariot to the Egyptian army. They're thought to have brought sickle swords, like those curved blades that are pretty effective at lopping off a limb or a head. And composite bows, that's another really critical, that's a bow with exceptionally strong tensile strength. So you can fire basically a deadly shot that'll go straight through somebody and it can penetrate armor. And most of the time the people back then are wearing leather armor as a means of protection. And so the composite bow is introduced to the Nile Valley by these foreign rulers, the Hyksos as well. So this is going to modernize Egypt's military. But that is ultimately what is going to sort of bring an end to the Middle Kingdom, is this Hyksos invasion. And they collapse the ruling dynasty there and take over for themselves. Now, another interesting change happens in the Middle Kingdom, and this is religious change. So, during the Middle Kingdom, this deity known as Osiris is going to be promoted heavily, and he's actually made into the chief god in the folk religion of Egypt. So, this is telling us something about what's happening in Egyptian society at the time. Osiris is originally known as the god of the afterlife, but he is going to death and rebirth. This idea of cyclical death and rebirth is something that starts to dominate Egyptian thought during the Middle Kingdom. So he is going to be elevated to a chief god because of his association with this process of death and rebirth. He's also understood to be responsible for natural cycles, flooding and drought, a growing season and harvest. And so he's also going to become the patron deity of the ruling class. It's through Osiris that the ruling class says that they can become immortal. They can achieve eternal life. This has everything to do with the myths surrounding Osiris. I'm not super familiar with ancient Egyptian mythology, but I'll try and give you the quick and dirty on Osiris. He's basically this god of the afterlife, and his brother kind of conspires against him to essentially kill him and throw his body amongst the Nile River. He scatters, I think I've got the details right there. He cuts his body up into little pieces, scatters it across the Nile River. Well, Osiris's sister, I think it's Isis, not positive on that. I think it's Isis. His sister Isis puts them back together and marries him. So they end up having this incestuous relationship, not something wholly unique for the ancient world's deities. But this is going to be start to reinforce that idea of eternal life through the afterlife, that you're reborn in the afterlife. And this really further popularizes the process of mummification in the Middle Kingdom. So, when you're thinking about the Middle Kingdom and trends associated with it, you have the growth of a middle class because there are better established trade routes, the erection of forts to protect those trade routes from increasing attempts to rob people by bandits and marauders, and then the shift to Osiris as a chief god and becoming a god of the ruling class or a patron of the ruling class. The New Kingdom is going to be the other period of Egyptian history that we're going to be looking at. And there's a few others. We'll move a little past that. Really, we're trying to get it up to Ptolemaic Egypt, but I won't say much about that because it comes up in our discussion of Greek history. The Hyksos invasion occurred around 650 BCE, and they ruled there for about a century. And that's when the Egyptians collapsed in what's called the Second Intermediate Period, where there's no clear central leadership in Egypt. ultimately, the Hyksos they're not that bad to the Egyptian people. They don't treat them that cruelly. It's not like they turn the citizenry into slaves. They don't overtax them. They don't really beat the people down too bad. They don't beat them up. But they're always going to be seen as foreign rulers. And so there's a lot of resistance to the Hyksos. So they're always seen as foreign leadership. They're not cruel to their subjects, but the people always hate them because they're seen as being outsiders leading the country. So it's not surprising that there's going to be a rebellion led against the Hyksos rulers. And this rebellion starts in Thebes. There's a bunch of noble or wealthy people in the city of Thebes, and they are going to stage a rebellion against the Hyksos at around 1550 BCE. And they are going to become the founding dynasty of what we call the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. And that starts in 1550 BCE and it ends around 1077 BCE. Naturally, the first thing this group of nobles is going to do when they take over and form a new dynasty is shift the capital to Thebes, their home city. From Thebes, actually, they quickly kind of abandoned that. Dynasty moves on and abandons that capital, and they shifted over to a city known as Amarna. So they quickly realized that Egypt can't rely on its geography for protection alone. And so one of the things that this new dynasty and the new kingdom is going to do, something you should probably remember them for, is set about building an incredibly powerful military. That's what they're all about. And they're borrowing a lot of those elements from the Hyksos. They're going to they start right alongside their traditional foot soldiers. They're using archers and charioteers. They adopted new weapons, technology, and military strategies from the vanquished Hyksos. And so this is where the new kingdom is also known as the Egyptian Empire. And what you really need to understand, remember about this period is this is when Egypt grows in military strength. Shortly after removing the Hyksos and modernizing their army, this new ruling dynasty of the New Kingdom is going to start engaging in heavy military conquest outside of the Nile River Valley. They're going to head south into Nubia and conquer that area between 1550 and 750 BCE. It's a long conquest, and really what they're looking to do is take the kingdom of Kush, which is a very wealthy and powerful kingdom to the south of Egypt. So their goal also is going to be to push eastward into Asia. They're doing this in the 1400s BCE. They're pushing into the Levant. They're pushing into the Sinai Peninsula. And by the end of the New Kingdom, they'd successfully invaded, conquered, and politically ruled groups outside of the Nile River Valley. And so this is what kind of completes Egypt's shift from territorial state into empire. This is when it happens. And so the New Kingdom is associated with this idea of the Egyptian Empire. Another thing that's going to happen during this time period is we start to see the diffusion of temples around far-flung areas of Egypt. This is a unique process. If you remember looking back to what's happening in Mesopotamia, you set up a temple in your capital city and then force everybody from around it to come to that area. Religion in the New Kingdom in Egypt is way more localized. Essentially what they're going to do is there's a period where they shift away here in the New Kingdom. It's no longer Osiris as the big chief god that everybody's looking at. It becomes Amun, or the sun god, who gets elevated to the chief god in the New Kingdom. But under Amun, there is the worship of a ton of lesser deities, and it proliferates a lot. It grows during this period. You start to see that a rapid rise in temple construction in every city around Egypt. So in any local area or any sort of locale in Egypt, everyone worships Amun as a chief god, but they also worship the lesser deities, the less important local deities. So there are a lot of examples of this. You have temples to Sobek, Bastet, Isis, Mut, Hathor, Taweret. These are all different gods who perform different functions in the Egyptian pantheon, and they all have cultic centers of worship in different areas around Egypt. And so it's not always centered in Amarna, in the capital. These temples are far-flung. They're in different places. And so if you are a follower of Sobek, you go to Crocodilopolis. If you're a follower of Bastet, you go to Bustasis, where her cultic center is. And so what we tend to see here, with most empires, they centralize the religion. But in Egypt, it worked kind of the different way. It became more diffuse and spread out during this time period. Now, there's a few other key developments happening during the New Kingdom. They're just kind of like little interesting side notes that you do need to know about them in your exam. But they are not necessarily tied to the trajectory of this history. But Hatshepsut is one of the most important parts of the New Kingdom when we look at this. I said there was only one real female pharaoh in ancient Egypt, and that is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is going to rise up during the New Kingdom, and she's a big part of encouraging commerce and trade as a pharaoh. What's interesting about Hatshepsut is in her lifetime, she's the only female pharaoh in Egyptian history, again, barring Cleopatra, who is not necessarily seen as an Egyptian, but rather as a sort of foreign ruler. Hatshepsut wanted to be treated like any other pharaoh. She didn't want to be remembered as the only female pharaoh. She didn't want to be just the new female pharaoh. She didn't want her sex to be, or gender identification to be the subject of conversation about her leadership. So socially, she chooses to dress like a man. She uses male titles and pronouns. And anytime there's a statue constructed of her, with the exception of a few ones that were buried in her burial chamber, she is generally going to be portrayed as a man on those statues. And because of this, when you read literature about her, the sources will call her a man a lot of times. And then the statues look like men. So for a long time, Egyptologists thought Hatshepsut was a man, a male pharaoh. But as we got a little bit further into the subject and found more evidence about this, turns out that she was in fact a female. She just lived socially as a male, something that's not uncommon in older societies. So that is one sort of notable development in the New Kingdom. Another one is the fact that for a very brief time period, monotheism is actually going to be established. They abandoned the Egyptian pantheon in favor of the worship of a single god. And this happened under the reign of a pharaoh known as Amenhotep IV. And he does this around 353 BCE. He worshipped himself. It was a personal thing for him. He worshipped one god, a god by the name of Aten. And he built a temple to Aten at a site that he calls Akhenaten. And when he builds this new temple, he puts out an edict or a decree for all of Egypt. And he says, you are no longer allowed to worship any of these other gods. Aten is the only god. And everybody will worship Aten. And so, as you can imagine, when everybody has put all this time and money into developing smaller cultic shrines in localized areas, they are not happy when this guy comes forward and says, you need to abandon all that worship and just follow Aten. So the next pharaoh in after Amenhotep is, and he later calls himself Akhenaten, or Amenaten, I forget. Anywho, it's not that important. But the next pharaoh is going to immediately say, this was a terrible idea, this push for monotheism, and he immediately restores the polytheistic pantheon of traditional Egyptian gods. So there is a third intermediate period that is part of a much wider trend. Again, one that you read about in your textbook. This is known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it's a 50-year period between 1200 BCE and 1150 BCE. And what generally happens in this time period is societies, empires, large empires all over Eurasia just suddenly and violently collapse. They all just start falling apart. There's a lot of different reasons. You could go to every individual collapse and say there's specific localized reasons for it. And so to generalize is not always the best way to do it. But there are a lot of general trends that historians have looked at and said this is why it happens all over Eurasia all at the same time, all at once. There are environmental factors going on here. There's a lot of volcanoes in the Near East and Mediterranean that become active during this time period. That just forces an end to some kingdoms and states. They have to abandon their present location, just up and move, because they're going to be killed by a volcano if they don't. Drought also becomes widespread during this period, and that puts pressure on agriculture and food resources. Well, when people are hungry and starving, and you have a living God who's supposed to be propitiating the afterlife and the spirit world to give you a good growing season, and you're suffering from drought, your political structure doesn't last long, because it's the Pharaoh's job to make the Nile flood. So if the Nile doesn't flood and you don't grow food, that Pharaoh's out of a job. He's gone. So you can see the sort of relationship between environmental pressures and then political change. So there's also a lot of new development there's new bronze working techniques at the end of the Bronze Age, and they're developing new weapons and devastating techniques of warfare. And this is going to lead to constant conflict, and it really upends this entire region of the world. The Egyptians are going to survive the late Bronze Age collapse, but not at any level of strength that they existed in before. They're weakened badly, and then they kind of limp on until the New Kingdom collapses in 1070 BCE. And so this is the date associated with the death of Ramses XI. The entire New Kingdom was ruled over by the Ramses. Every pharaoh took a title of Ramses from a certain point moving forward after Hatshepsut and Akhenaten and all those guys and gals. So the third intermediate period lasted for over 700 years. This is just a long sort of blah period of Egyptian history where it's hard to define what's actually going on. There's a power vacuum. There's no real idea of who's in charge. You got no real central authority, no developments in religion or the state. So these sea peoples are going to be the ones largely credited for devastating all of the empires along the Mediterranean coast. And Egypt's no exception. The sea peoples, and we still, as historians, we're still debating who these people are. Obviously, they're a seafaring people who come from the Mediterranean, but we don't know what their original location is. They could have been from Crete. They could have been from Minoa. They could have been from mainland Greece. They could have been from Italy. They could have been from Malta. They could have been from North Africa. No one knows where the sea people actually came from. But they basically are just a big confederacy of people who trade and do business over the Mediterranean, and they become militarized and they start raiding all of the large empires for wealth. So Egypt breaks down into smaller states, and it was run by foreign rulers over the next 700 years. You see a succession of Cushites, Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and then Romans are all going to become the rulers of Egypt after Ramses' death. So really, with the collapse of the New Kingdom, that's pretty much the end of true Egyptian history. Everybody after that is going to be a foreign ruler. And one of these foreign rulers we're going to look at, the last thing we'll talk about today, is the establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And this it starts with the invasion of Alexander the Great. Egypt is going to eventually fall to all these other outside rulers, right? And they're also going to become they become victims of the growth of the the really well-known empires of the Mediterranean and the Near East. So the establishment of Egypt's last pharaonic dynasty, and I kind of put that in quotes because it's not a true pharaoh, it was tied to the conquest of Alexander the Great. Alexander invades Egypt in 332 BCE. And so the territory at that time was under Persian rule, so they had outside rulers already. And Alexander comes in and drives the Persians out. And he pushes them out of Egypt, and as far as he's concerned, that's just the beginning of his conquest. He's going to continue on trying to conquer the rest of the known world. But one of Alexander's Macedonian Greek bodyguards, by the name of Ptolemy, was placed in charge of Egypt in 305 BCE. He was made the ruler of Egypt at the time of Alexander, right around the time he's dying. So, what happens with this is the beginning, obviously Ptolemy starts it. This is the beginning of what's known as the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egyptian history. The Ptolemaic rulers are not Egyptians. They're Greeks. They are ethnically, racially, everything. They are Greek people. They speak Greek at home. That is their mother tongue, the Macedonian dialect of Greek to be particular. But what's interesting is they come in and they take over Egypt, and they call themselves pharaohs. They style themselves after the old Egyptian pharaohs, the rulers of the old, middle, and new kingdom. They dress like the old pharaohs would. They have great respect for Egyptian culture and history. And so they model their dress, their symbols of authority. And a lot of them even go as far as to model their religious habits off of the old Egyptian habits. Now, again, they generally would be Greek speakers, but some of the Ptolemaic rulers actually learned the tongue of the Egyptian people they have now conquered. So they're sort of a multilingual class, but it suffices to say that their language is Greek. That's what they're speaking in the ruling class in the upper echelons of Egypt during the Ptolemaic dynasty. So while the Ptolemies did have pretty good respect for Egyptian culture, the Egyptians don't necessarily feel the same way. They kind of have a lukewarm relationship with these new foreign rulers. Most Egyptians felt that the Ptolemies, like everybody who came before them, were just interlopers, and they also felt that they were kind of overbearing rulers. So the Ptolemaic dynasty comes in, and once again we see a religious change. They say the new god of this land is Zeus. The Greek god of lightning, and they make him the patron god of Egypt. And even the emblem of the Ptolemies is an eagle, a representative of Zeus, holding like a bundle with a lightning bolt and something else coming through it. But they believe that basically it all ties back to Alexander the Great. The belief of the Macedonians who followed him, the Greeks, was that he was born of Zeus, that Zeus came down and impregnated Alexander's mother, and he was thus the offspring of Zeus, like a semi-divine figure. So you see a lot of cultic centers starting to pop up in Ptolemaic Egypt, where they're actually they're dedicated to Zeus, but other ones are actually dedicated to worshiping Alexander the Great himself. He becomes a god in parts of Egypt. But the local people tend to continue on with the religious figures they have always been worshiping. And the Ptolemies are okay with this. They are going to deify Alexander and make cultic centers and temples to him. But they also have a strong affinity for the Egyptian goddess Isis. For whatever reason, the Ptolemies feel very strongly about Isis, and they feel very strongly about another Egyptian god named Ptah, or Ta. I don't know if you're supposed to pronounce the P or not. Again, I'm not fluent in ancient Egyptian. So, among some of the stranger ways to enshrine the native customs and their habits, the Grecian Ptolemies are actually going to look back and they read the legend of Osiris. And they look at this practice of how Osiris marries his sister. And she's the one who puts them back together. And basically, what the Ptolemies start doing is they go, oh, here's how we can endear ourselves to the natives. I'm going to start marrying my sister and my brothers. So actually the Ptolemies, and it's not wholly uncommon, they believe that they're keeping royal blood royal by not mixing with commoners. But they start to marry their siblings to keep this purely Grecian ruling class moving forward in Egypt. So, as the Greek Empire grew, the Ptolemies fought to maintain control of their little fiefdom in Egypt. The Ptolemies are going to maintain this position in Egypt until the last ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, and that's Cleopatra. And we'll talk about her story and how she kind of has this relationship with Mark Antony and with Caesar, Julius Caesar, and really it's the Roman Empire that'll bring an end to the Ptolemaic Egyptian dynasty right around 30 BCE. And so that kind of ties up ancient Egyptian history. We took it all the way from nomads moving into the Nile to when the Greeks have taken it over. And we'll talk a little bit more about what Egypt looks like when we talk about the growth and expansion of the Greek world and the Greek Empire and the Hellenistic cultures of the Mediterranean. And we'll even be talking about it a little more. Egypt's really kind of an important center in the world. So you can't just kind of gloss over Egypt at any point. Whether you're talking about the Greeks or the Romans, Egypt is central. Or the Persians, or even later on, the Ottomans. Egypt is always going to be this sort of central location in the old world. And so that's where I'm going to wrap up the lecture for today. We tied up real neatly what's going on in ancient Egypt and looked at the growth of societies there, watching it turn from a group of nomads moving in all the way up through a territorial state and into an empire. So As usual, if you got any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to drop me a line. Always shoot me an email through my direct emails, the quickest way to get me, davyj@uhd.edu. So, have a good week, and I will see you all during our next video lecture. Take care.